Today my talk will focus on tsunami modeling and my use of GeoClaw's adaptive mesh refinement for reducing computation time while keeping the accuracy of the simulations. For the outline of my talk, I will give an introduction into tsunamis, why it's important to study and model them. I'll go into the details of the model I use, GeoClaw, provide some examples of the adaptive mesh refinement and validation of the tsunamis, and then ramp up. Tsunamis are a series of ocean waves that are generated in response to earthquakes, landslides, extreme weather, asteroid impacts, or a combination of these. They are characterized as a series of long-period waves that can cross oceans at speeds of up to 1,000 kilometers per hour. In the deep ocean, tsunamis do not raise the sea surface that dramatically, but as they approach land, the speed rapidly diminishes, allowing subsequent waves to stack together, which corresponds to an increase in sea surface that can cause extreme flooding, damage, and lives lost. This picture is from the Tohoku tsunami on March 11, 2011, in response to a large magnitude 9.1 earthquake along the Japanese subduction zone. In the figure, you can see the water cresting and running down onto a road. It is coming completely over top of a seawall that was there to protect this community. The types of tsunamis that I study are the ones generated by earthquakes, in particular subduction zones. These large underwater motions between two tectonic plates can cause massive uplift or subsidence, or both, at the plate boundaries and allows water to be displaced in such large volumes that they generate the tsunami waves. Because many people live in coastal regions, understanding how tsunamis are generated, how they travel, and the likelihood of them occurring is important for risk management, community planning, and early warnings. There are some notable earthquake-generated tsunamis, which will be the kind I will focus on in my talk. This is a list of some of them that have happened, impacting communities around the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In 1700, a large rupture along the Cascadia subduction zone generated a tsunami that's been recorded by Japanese archives because it traveled from just offshore Washington, Oregon, and Northern California and went all the way to Japan and caused some damage to some farmer fields. They referred to this as the orphan tsunami because they saw the tsunami but they didn't feel an earthquake. In 1960, in Chile, the largest earthquake ever recorded by modern instrumentation generated a tsunami that caused many deaths, displaced hundreds of thousands of Chileans, and additionally caused deaths in Hawaii and other regions. The 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake generated a tsunami that caused 124 deaths and destruction of coastlines as far away as California and Hawaii. In 2004, the Sumatra earthquake was devastating. It caused over 200,000 deaths, as well as a lot of infrastructure damage. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami caused over 18,000 deaths. So why do we do tsunami modeling? This graphic shows the locations of tsunami-generating earthquakes around the Pacific Ocean throughout time. The data was extracted from the National Geophysical Data Center and includes information from as far back as 2000 BC, from which we found evidence of historical tsunamis. We model these events to better understand them, to understand the risk facing coastal communities around the world, to better prepare emergency management plans in the event a tsunami occurs. The benefits of tsunami modeling in different frameworks include understanding the past to gain a greater understanding of how the forces work, estimating the scenarios that can cause the most damage and where the higher risk areas are, to improve response to these disasters, to prepare our communities to know where the tsunami will likely go and what are the safer areas to evacuate to. Also to plan communities so that nothing is built in higher risk areas, and for communities that are nearest the earthquakes to generate early warning. The model I use for studying tsunamis is called GeoClaw. It's part of ClawPack, which is an open source software package that stands for Conservation Law Package. GeoClaw solves the shallow water equations for geophysical applications, mostly tsunamis and storm surge. It has been validated for tsunami simulations by the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program. And at its core feature is adaptive mesh refinement, which allows for increasing resolution when and where it is needed. Adaptive mesh refinement, AMR, is a series of nested grids as illustrated in this graphic. AMR allows for increasing refinement when and where it is needed. Each grid level is smaller and nested inside the level below it. This makes it easier to refine areas where you want a high level of detail and leave coarser areas so that the solution is calculated faster. For example, in most modeling scenarios, the open ocean would stay at a fairly coarse refinement because the wave calculations do not require a higher resolution for accuracy. But as the waves approach the coastline, the refinement can be turned on to get greater detail for coastal reflections and inundation. GeoClaw's inputs require bathymetric and topographic data of the region to be studied. Additionally, an earthquake finite fault model with an appropriate slip distribution. The boundaries of the region should also include some of the ocean basin to more accurately represent the boundary conditions that are part of the shallow water equations. To perform tsunami modeling with GeoClaw, we first need to calculate the seafloor deformation from the earthquake. GeoClaw has a built-in function to calculate the deformation that requires bathymetric data and a finite fault model of the earthquake. The deformation is calculated with the Okada model from 1985. The fault information needs to include the location, slip, strike, rake, depth, and size of each fault tile. GeoClaw's Okada implementation allows for both static, which is instantaneous, and dynamic rupture of the earthquake. This is an example of a finite fault model for a project I worked on this summer, which was about the 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake and Tsunami. One problem I encountered while verifying the solution accuracy through comparison with an existing tide gauge data was the arrival of the first wave. Originally, I calculated the deformation with a static rupture, but found that the arrival time wasn't quite correct. After changing to a dynamic rupture, it cleared up the problem. This animation is of a dynamic rupture that illustrates how this particular earthquake ripped the subduction zone towards the southwest. I found the timing of the earthquake in the literature that suggested the entire earthquake took approximately 4 minutes to fully rupture. Additionally, GeoClaw can calculate the rise time of each individual fault tile if that information is provided. However, I did not utilize this functionality due to a lack of clear data on each individual tile's movement time. Validating a hindcast tsunami is important to illustrate solution accuracy. This is from the 1964 Alaska tsunami, and the fault model I found to be most accurate. The top figure is from a report saved in the National Geophysical Data Center on tsunamis from 1806 to 1992. It's an old copy of a marogram recorded at Nia Bay during this earthquake. The bottom figure is my plot of that exact same tide gauge location from the simulation. Sadly, because there's no digital data available for this marogram, I verified it without overlaying both plots. In the figures, you can see that the tsunami starts to arrive at approximately 7 a.m. GMT. The maximum wave height of the first wave is generally reflected between the simulation and the actual data, and the peaks and troughs kind of line up. They're not exact, and unfortunately the scale was hard to match when I was making this figure. But the general character of the waveform is similar enough to consider that this simulation is a success. This is another example of validating a source model with the waveforms output by GeoClaw. This fault model is from Shao et al., and it is from the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in 2011. I validated GeoClaw's output with actual tide gauge recordings at various points along the Japanese shoreline. The points are represented in the black dots that unfortunately cannot be read very easily. You can see, depending on the location, that the general structure of the waveforms match between the program output in blue and the tide gauge recordings in red. Some of the oscillations of the waveforms are not captured by GeoClaw, and that could be because of the refinement issues, as in it's not refined enough around those areas, or because simulations aren't exact models of what happens in real life. To go further into AMR, this is a graphic that illustrates how the boxes are created automatically with GeoClaw. Now the user can define regions that they want to particularly focus on, but this is a representative of the 2010 Chile earthquake and tsunami, and GeoClaw is automatically refining based on the waves. So you can see as the wave moves outwards, the boxes get narrower ahead of the waves and then get larger as the wave passes on, because we don't need to look at that detail anymore. How does AMR help with simulations? One of the biggest challenges in modeling coastal events is that depending on your input bathymetry, there can be millions of individual points that are monitored for the tsunami, and this can really increase computation time dramatically. In this figure, I'm showing the difference between two different AMR levels. The blue one, which is more coarse, is representing 6,750 meters in diameter of each grid cell, and the red dotted line represents 1,687 meters as the diameter of each grid. The more refined red one has a larger peak of the first wave, closer to 3.2 meters, whereas the less refined one is just above 3 meters. And the oscillations as the waves pass are slightly different as well. However, the general character is the same, and I would consider not wasting my time on the more refined for this particular area just because of the time difference in computation. These two tables are examples of the cost of changing AMR refinement levels. This particular data is the same simulations as the previous slide, where the data point was in the middle of the ocean and didn't need much refinement. However, between the two sets of refinement, the computation time skyrocketed. On the left is the original with the more coarse grids, and it took a total of 105 seconds to complete all the calculations of the simulation. On the right, just by changing it from 6,750 meter resolution to the 1,687 meter resolution, the time jumped from 106 seconds to 2,400 seconds, which is about 40 minutes. If you're trying to balance the computation time, but also look at coastal inundation, which in most circumstances you'd want 10 to 20 meters resolution, you could see where the simulations would take too long. This is where AMR shines, because you can turn it on and off for specific regions as the waves approach, both automatically by GeoClaw for that example we saw above, and by user-defined for specific regions. The outputs that GeoClaw can produce include deep ocean sea surface amounts. In this example, this happened to be fairly close to the subduction zone, so we get a dramatic spike in the sea surface in regards to the wave arrival. Near shore, shallow water sea surface. From this one, this is the tide gauge at Nia Bay, which is tucked around a little cove. Snapshots in time of the solution. So this particular example, you can see some blockiness to the coloration, which is the AMR refining around the topographical areas. And this happened to be between two waves, so there's some water still lingering while the rest is receding. And lastly, an overview of the maximum water and wave heights recorded during the simulation. This gives the maximum amount over the course of the simulation and is not necessarily a snapshot in a specific time frame. And just a larger version of that last one, this is one of the figures that I produce frequently, is to check where the inundation is, and at this level of detail, which is approximately 18 meters of resolution, you can see the floodplain, a river getting inundated, and what the bay water levels were during the highest inundation of the simulation. In conclusion, we model tsunamis because we want to understand how they work while also mitigating the risks of coastal hazards to protect communities and people around the world. GeoClaw's specific role is that it provides a fairly accurate solution while also being able to balance the computational resources needed to obtain that solution. And you can do this from anywhere as long as you have a computer. The adaptive mesh refinement at the core of GeoClaw enables us to balance the simulation accuracy with efficient computation, allowing us to spend more time looking at areas of interest and less time just calculating solutions for regions that are not in that particular study. And finally, GeoClaw has been validated with historical earthquakes and tsunami events, including some that are generated through finite fault models using GNSS data or seismic wave data. So it is a robust platform for the modeling of tsunamis. Thank you.